The orange glow on the horizon looked like the end of the world, flames racing across the dry grassland faster than any horse could run. And Beatrice Vernon knew that if she did not move in the next 30 seconds, her wedding dress would become her funeral shroud. She stood frozen at the window of the small church in Animas Forks, Colorado, her hands clutching the ivory lace at her waist, watching the prairie fire devour everything in its path. Behind her, the wedding guests had already fled, their panicked footsteps echoing through the mountain town as they scattered toward the mines and stone buildings that might offer protection. Her intended groom, a silver mine owner named Theodore Ashford, had run first, shouting something about saving his investment properties, leaving her alone with nothing but her veil and the growing heat that made the air shimmer like water. The year was 1878, and Beatrice had traveled all the way from Boston to marry a man she had met only twice through correspondence arranged by her aunt. She was 20 years old, practical-minded, and had believed this would be a sensible match. Theodore was 42, wealthy, and had promised her security in a territory that promised very little to anyone. But now, watching him disappear into the chaos without a backward glance, she understood that some promises were made of smoke. The fire roared closer, consuming the sagebrush and dried grasses that surrounded the mining town. Animas Forks sat at nearly 11,000 feet elevation, nestled in a narrow valley where the winters were brutal and the summers short but desperately dry. This August had seen no rain for weeks, and someone's cooking fire, or perhaps a lightning strike, had turned the landscape into kindling. Beatrice gathered her skirts and ran toward the church door, but the heat hit her like a physical wall. Flames had already reached the wooden structures at the edge of town, and burning embers flew through the air like malevolent fireflies. She turned back, searching for another exit, her heart hammering against her corset stays. That was when Fletcher Morrison kicked open the side door of the church, his silhouette dark against the orange hell beyond. He was a working cowboy, lean and weathered, with dust on his leather chaps and a bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. His eyes, a startling gray-green, locked onto her through the smoke. "You planning to die in that dress, or you want to live?" he shouted over the roar of the approaching inferno. "The main door is blocked," Beatrice called back, coughing as smoke began to fill the small church. Fletcher did not wait for more explanation. He crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides, and before Beatrice could protest or prepare herself, he bent down and hoisted her over his shoulder like she weighed no more than a sack of grain. The world tilted violently, and she found herself staring at the back of his worn leather vest, her carefully arranged curls falling loose from their pins. "Hold on," he commanded, and then he was running. Fletcher burst through the side door and into a world transformed into chaos. The fire had surrounded 3 sides of the town, and the only clear path was up, toward the higher mountain passes where the timber had not yet caught. Burning sparks rained down around them, singeing Beatrice's dress and landing on Fletcher's hat. He ran with surprising speed for a man carrying another person, his boots finding purchase on the rocky ground as he navigated away from the wooden buildings and toward the creek that ran through the center of town. Other townspeople were already in the water, soaking blankets and clothing, trying to create a fire break. Children cried, women shouted for lost family members, and men formed bucket brigades that seemed pathetically inadequate against the wall of flame bearing down on them. Fletcher splashed into the creek, the cold mountain water shockingly frigid even in August. He set Beatrice down, but kept one arm around her waist, steadying her as she found her footing on the slippery rocks. The water came up to her knees, instantly soaking through the layers of silk and petticoats. "Soak your dress," he ordered, pushing her gently downward. "Get it completely wet. It might save your life." Beatrice did not argue. She dropped into the creek, gasping at the cold, dunking herself completely under the surface. When she came up, sputtering and shivering, Fletcher was doing the same, wetting down his clothes and hat. Around them, 24 others had the same idea, and the creek was crowded with desperate people. The fire reached the first row of buildings, and the dry wood exploded into flame with a sound like thunder. The church where Beatrice had been standing moments before was engulfed, the white paint blistering and peeling before the entire structure collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and burning timber. Fletcher grabbed her hand. "We cannot stay here. If the fire jumps the creek, we will be trapped. We need to get to the high rocks." "What about everyone else?" Beatrice looked around at the terrified faces, at mothers clutching children, at old men who look too exhausted to move. They will follow or they will not. Right now, I'm worried about you. Fletcher's voice was rough, urgent. He started pulling her through the water, heading upstream, where the creek narrowed and climbed toward the rocky slopes above the town. Beatrice wanted to protest, to insist they help others, but the heat was becoming unbearable even in the water. The fire was sucking the oxygen from the air, making each breath painful and difficult. She focused on moving, on keeping up with Fletcher's longer strides, on not losing her footing on the mossy rocks beneath the surface. They climbed out of the creek where it tumbled down in a small waterfall, the spray providing some relief from the heat and smoke. Fletcher led her up a narrow game trail, still holding her hand, pulling her along when she stumbled over her waterlogged skirts. Behind them, Animus Forks was disappearing under a blanket of fire and smoke. They climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, until they reached an outcropping of bare granite that jutted from the mountainside. Fletcher finally stopped, breathing hard, and guided Beatrice to sit on the rock. From this vantage point, they could see the entire valley below, and the sight was both terrible and magnificent. The prairie fire had swept through the grasslands like an avenging angel, turning everything to ash in its wake. The town itself was half gone, buildings burning like candles, but the creek had saved the northern section where most people had gathered. As they watched, the wind shifted, pushing the fire away from the remaining structures and up the opposite slope where there was less fuel to feed it. "It's moving away," Beatrice said, her voice hoarse from smoke. "The town might survive." "Some of it," Fletcher agreed. He sat down beside her, removing his hat to wipe sweat and soot from his face. His dark blonde hair was plastered to his head, and there were burn marks on his vest and sleeves. "You all right?" Beatrice took inventory of herself. Her wedding dress was ruined, blackened with soot and torn in a dozen places. Her shoes were gone, lost somewhere in the creek or on the climb. Her carefully styled hair hung in wet tangles down her back, but she was alive and relatively unharmed, save for some scrapes and bruises. "I am alive because of you," she said, meeting his eyes. "Thank you does not seem adequate." Fletcher shrugged, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same. My intended husband did not." The words came out more bitter than Beatrice intended, but they were true. Theodore had abandoned her without a second thought. "Then he is a fool," Fletcher said simply. He looked away, studying the burning landscape. "You are the Boston bride, right? Came in on the stage last week? You know about that?" Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire below. It's a small town. Everyone knows everyone's business. Fletcher glanced at her sideways. "Heard you were marrying old Theodore Ashford. Heard you were doing it sight unseen, more or less." It seemed practical at the time. Beatrice pulled at her wet skirts, trying to preserve some modesty, even though they were plastered to her legs. "I had no prospects in Boston. My parents died 2 years ago, and I was living with my aunt, who made it very clear I was a burden. Theodore offered security, a home, a life out west. And what did he get out of it?" Fletcher's tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "A young wife, presumably. A woman to manage his household and bear his children." Beatrice spoke without emotion, stating facts. It was a transaction, not a love match. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, watching the smoke rise into the late afternoon sky. The sun was beginning to set, turning the smoke and clouds into shades of crimson and gold, a sunset made more spectacular by the disaster below. "My spread is about 10 miles east of here," he finally said. "Small ranch, just me and my brother Frank. We run cattle and horses, break mustangs sometimes. It is not fancy, but it is honest work." Beatrice did not understand why he was telling her this until she saw the way he was looking at her, careful and assessing, like he was considering a difficult decision. "Why are you in town today?" she asked, instead of responding to his implicit statement. "Delivering horses to the mine. Was supposed to get paid and head back. But then the fire started." He stood up, offering her his hand. "Sun's going down. We should head back and see what's left." The climb down was easier than the climb up, though Beatrice's bare feet made it painful. Fletcher noticed her limping and, without asking permission, scooped her up again. This time he carried her in his arms rather than over his shoulder, which was more dignified but somehow more intimate. Beatrice could feel the solid strength of him, could smell smoke and sweat and leather and something else, something essentially masculine that made her acutely aware of how close they were. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Not on those feet, you cannot." Fletcher kept moving, sure-footed even on the steep trail. "Save your pride for when it will not cost you blood." By the time they reached what remained of Anima's Forks, full darkness had fallen, broken only by the orange glow of dying fires and lanterns being carried by survivors. The scene was grim, but not as catastrophic as it might have been. The northern half of town had survived, including most of the residences and the largest mine operations. The southern section, including the church, the hotel, and several businesses, was gone, reduced to smoking foundations and twisted metal. People were gathered in the street, taking count of who had survived and who had not. Beatrice heard crying and shouting, saw the shock on soot-covered faces, and felt a wave of guilt that she had survived while others had perhaps not been so fortunate. Fletcher set her down gently in front of the general store, which had survived intact. "Wait here. I will find you something for your feet and see if I can locate your intended." He disappeared into the crowd before Beatrice could respond. She leaned against the store's wall, suddenly exhausted, her legs shaking with delayed reaction to the terror and exertion. Other survivors gave her curious looks, and she realized what a sight she must be in her destroyed wedding dress, covered in soot and creek water, her hair wild. "Miss Vernon?" A woman approached, middle-aged with kind eyes and a practical manner. "I am Martha Grimes. I run the boarding house. Well, I did. It burned down." She smiled grimly. "But I have supplies. Let me get you something warm to drink and a blanket." Beatrice accepted gratefully, and soon found herself sitting on a crate with a tin cup of bitter coffee and a wool blanket around her shoulders. Martha bustled around, organizing relief efforts with the efficiency of a general, directing people to homes that could take in those who had lost everything, coordinating food supplies, making lists of what was needed. Fletcher returned with a pair of worn boots that were too large but better than nothing, and some thick socks. He knelt in front of her and gently examined her feet, his touch surprisingly careful for such work-roughened hands. Beatrice felt that strange flutter again, something she had never experienced with Theodore. "You will have blisters, but nothing looks serious," he said. He helped her into the socks and boots, tying the laces securely. "I found Theodore. He is at the Silver Bell mine, helping secure their equipment. He asked if you were safe, and I told him yes." Something in Fletcher's tone suggested what Theodore had not asked, had not said, had not done. "Did he ask where I was, if I needed anything?" Beatrice already knew the answer. "No." Fletcher stood up, his jaw tight. "He said he would call on you tomorrow, once things settled down." Tomorrow? Her wedding day had ended in disaster. She had nearly died, and her intended husband would call on her tomorrow when it was convenient. The absurdity of it made Beatrice want to laugh or cry or possibly both. "I am staying at the Grimes boarding house," she said, though of course the boarding house no longer existed. "Or I was." "You can stay with my sister-in-law," Martha Grimes interjected, having overheard. "Sarah has room and could use the company. Her husband is my brother, works in the mines. They have a good cabin on the north edge of town." Beatrice nodded, grateful for the kindness of strangers. She looked up at Fletcher, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you again," she said, "for saving my life." "You said that already." But he smiled slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face from merely weathered and handsome to something that made her heart do strange things in her chest. "I know, but it bears repeating." Beatrice stood, pulling the blanket tighter. "Will you be staying in town tonight?" "No. I need to get back to the ranch, check on my brother and the stock. Fire was headed east before the wind shifted, and I need to make sure it did not reach our land." He hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. "But I will be back in a few days, to check on things. On the town. On you." He did not say it, but Beatrice heard it anyway. Martha Grimes led Beatrice away to meet Sarah and find a place to sleep. As they walked through the devastated town, Beatrice looked back once and saw Fletcher still standing where she had left him, watching her go with an intensity that made her breath catch. She had come to Colorado to marry one man, but fate and fire had put her in the debt of another, and Beatrice was beginning to suspect that her carefully planned, practical future had just gone up in smoke. Sarah Grimes was a young woman not much older than Beatrice herself, with a friendly manner and a toddler son named James, who was mercifully asleep when they arrived at the small but well-built cabin. Her husband, Thomas, was still in town, helping with the cleanup, but Sarah welcomed Beatrice without hesitation, offering her a spare nightgown and a wash basin to clean the soot from her skin. "You are the Boston bride," Sarah said as she helped Beatrice untangle her ruined hair. "What a terrible day for a wedding." "The wedding never happened," Beatrice said. "We had not even exchanged vows when the fire reached town." "Still, you are betrothed. Mr. Ashford will want to reschedule, I am sure." Sarah's tone was carefully neutral, and Beatrice wondered what this woman knew about Theodore that she was not saying. Perhaps? Beatrice did not want to talk about Theodore. Instead, she asked, "Do you know Fletcher Morrison?" Sarah's hands paused in their work, and then continued, but Beatrice did not miss the slight smile that crossed her face. "Everyone knows Fletcher and Frank Morrison. They have a ranch east of here, good land near the creek. Fletcher supplies horses to most of the mines. Honest men, hard workers. Fletcher saved my life today." Beatrice stared at her reflection in the small mirror, barely recognizing herself with her hair loose and wild, her face pale beneath the lingering soot. "That sounds like Fletcher. He has a good heart, though he would never admit it." Sarah began braiding Beatrice's hair, her fingers quick and efficient. "He was supposed to marry a girl from Silverton 2 years ago, Mary Beth somebody, but she decided at the last minute that ranch life was too hard and married a banker instead. Fletcher has not courted anyone since." Beatrice absorbed this information silently. So, Fletcher Morrison had been hurt before, had his trust betrayed. Perhaps that was why he seemed so careful, so guarded. That night, Beatrice lay awake in the small guest room, listening to the sounds of the town slowly settling, the occasional shout or cry, the creak of wagon wheels as people moved belongings or searched through ruins. She thought about the day, about how close she had come to dying, about the difference between Theodore's cowardice and Fletcher's courage. She had come to Colorado seeking security, but what was security worth if it came with a man who would abandon her in a crisis? What kind of life would she have with someone who valued his investments over her life? And what was she thinking, questioning her betrothal after one dramatic afternoon with a cowboy who had simply done what any decent person would do? But Beatrice knew it was more than that. Something had passed between them on that mountainside, something unspoken but real. She had felt safer in the arms of a stranger running through fire than she had ever felt in Theodore's formal, correct presence. Theodore finally called on Beatrice 3 days after the fire, not the next day as Fletcher had relayed. By then, the town was deep into rebuilding efforts. Survivors were still being counted, and Beatrice had heard the final toll, 5 dead, including 2 children who had been trapped in a barn. The news had made her weep, both for the lost lives and for her own narrow escape. Theodore arrived at the Grimes cabin in his finest suit, looking untouched by the disaster. He was a handsome man in his way, with silver at his temples and the confidence of wealth, but his eyes were cool and appraising as they took in Beatrice's borrowed dress and simple appearance. "Miss Vernon, I am relieved to see you well." His voice was formal, distant. "I apologize for not calling sooner, but the mine operations required my immediate attention. We lost significant equipment in the fire. Not, 'I was worried about you,' or 'I am sorry I left you behind.' Just explanations about mining equipment." "I understand," Beatrice said, though she did not really. They sat in Sarah's small parlor, awkwardly separated by propriety and the gulf of what had happened. Theodore explained that he wanted to postpone the wedding by 3 weeks to allow time for rebuilding, and for Beatrice to acquire a new trousseau. He was practical and logical, laying out plans as if they were business arrangements. "Do you not want to know how I escaped the fire?" Beatrice finally interrupted his monologue about reconstruction schedules. Theodore paused, looking faintly annoyed at the interruption. "I was told you were rescued, I assume by one of the townspeople. Fletcher Morrison carried me through the fire. He saved my life when I was trapped in the church." Beatrice watched his face carefully, looking for any reaction. "Ah, yes, Morrison. He delivers horses." Theodore waved a hand dismissively. "You must thank him appropriately, perhaps a small payment for his trouble." A payment. As if her life could be repaid with coins. As if what Fletcher had done was a service rendered rather than an act of courage and compassion. "I do not think Mr. Morrison wants payment," Beatrice said carefully. Everyone wants payment, my dear. You will learn that about the West. Theodore stood, checking his pocket watch. I must return to the mine. We will speak again soon about the wedding arrangements. I trust you can stay here with Mrs. Grimes until then? He did not ask if she wanted to stay with him, did not offer her a place in his home, did not even attempt to touch her hand in affection or reassurance. He simply left, as formal and distant as he had arrived, leaving Beatrice feeling more alone than when she had been at her aunt's house in Boston. Sarah came in after Theodore left, carrying tea and sympathy in equal measure. You do not have to marry him, she said quietly. I have nowhere else to go. Beatrice accepted the tea, grateful for the warmth. I have no money, no family, no prospects. You have choices, even if they are difficult ones. Sarah sat beside her. You could work. Martha needs help reorganizing the boarding house. The school is always looking for teachers. You have education, skills. I came here to be married. But even as Beatrice said it, she knew how hollow it sounded. You came here seeking a new life. Maybe the life you thought you wanted is not the one you actually need. Sarah smiled gently. Just think about it. You have 3 weeks before the wedding. A lot can change in 3 weeks. Fletcher returned to Animas Forks 5 days after the fire, driving a wagon loaded with supplies. He had brought lumber from his ranch, fresh meat from a recent hunt, and bags of grain from his stores. He donated everything to the relief efforts, refusing payment, and then he asked where he might find Beatrice Vernon. Martha Grimes directed him to the temporary schoolhouse where Beatrice was helping organize donated clothing for families who had lost everything. Fletcher stood in the doorway, hat in hand, watching her work for a moment before she noticed him. When she did look up and their eyes met, Beatrice felt that same electric awareness, that same sense of recognition she had felt on the mountainside. She excused herself from the other volunteers and walked over to him, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance in a simple borrowed dress with her hair pulled back in a practical bun. Mr. Morrison, I heard you brought supplies for the town. That is very generous of you. Fletcher, just Fletcher. He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with the thanks. I wanted to check on you, make sure you were healing all right. I am well, thanks to you. Beatrice gestured outside, away from the curious eyes of the other volunteers. They walked into the afternoon sunshine, the air still carrying the faint scent of smoke and ash. I heard Theodore finally called on you. Fletcher's tone was carefully neutral, but his jaw was tight. He did. We are postponing the wedding for 3 weeks. Beatrice did not know why she was telling him this, but it felt important that he know. And you still want to marry him? After he left you to die? The words came out harsh, and Fletcher seemed to regret them immediately. I apologize. That was not my place to say. No, you are right to say it. Beatrice stopped walking, turning to face him fully. I have thought of little else these past days. I came to Colorado to marry Theodore because it seemed like the practical choice, the safe choice. But I am beginning to understand that safety is an illusion and practicality is cold comfort. Fletcher looked at her intently, his green-gray eyes searching her face. What will you do? I do not know yet. Beatrice was being more honest with this cowboy than she had been with herself. What would you do if you were me? I would marry someone I could trust, someone who would run toward the fire to save me, not away from it. Fletcher took a step closer, close enough that Beatrice could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could smell leather and pine and something clean and masculine. I would marry someone who made my heart race and my hands shake, not someone who made me feel safe and bored. Do I make your hands shake, Fletcher Morrison? Beatrice's voice came out breathless, surprising herself with her boldness. In answer, Fletcher held up his right hand, and Beatrice could see the slight tremor in his fingers. You have since the moment I saw you in that church, looking like an angel waiting for judgment. The confession hung between them, dangerous and thrilling. Beatrice knew she should step back, should remember her obligations and propriety, and the fact that she was betrothed to another man. But instead, she found herself swaying forward, drawn to Fletcher like iron to a lodestone. I cannot offer you what Theodore can, Fletcher said, his voice rough with emotion. I have a ranch, but it is small. I have some savings, but I am not wealthy. I can promise you hard work and uncertain weather, and a life that will not always be comfortable. What can you offer me? Beatrice asked, her heart hammering in her chest. Loyalty, partnership, a man who will never leave you behind, no matter what fire is coming. Fletcher reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently cupped her face with his calloused hand. "And love, if you will give me time to show you how that feels." Beatrice closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and felt something inside her chest crack open. This was what had been missing with Theodore, this spark, this connection, this sense of rightness. She had thought practical was enough, but now she knew better. "I need to speak with Theodore," she said, opening her eyes. "I need to end the betrothal properly." Hope flared in Fletcher's face, but he kept his voice steady. "Are you certain? I do not want you to make a choice you will regret. I am certain that I cannot marry a man who values property over people. I am certain that I would rather face an uncertain future with someone I could love than a secure future with someone I cannot respect." Beatrice turned her head and kissed his palm, feeling his sharp intake of breath. "I am certain that you make my hands shake too." Fletcher smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his entire face, and Beatrice felt the rightness of her decision settle into her bones. Breaking the betrothal with Theodore proved easier than Beatrice had feared, primarily because Theodore did not seem particularly invested in the marriage himself. When she called on him at his office in the Silver Bell mine, he listened to her carefully worded explanation, with the same detached interest he might show to a business report. "I see," he said when she finished. "This is about the cowboy who rescued you, I assume." Morrison. Beatrice refused to be ashamed. "It is about understanding what I need in a partner and recognizing that you and I would not suit. I would have provided well for you." Theodore sounded more puzzled than hurt. "I know, and you will make someone a good husband someday, someone who values security above all else." Beatrice stood, smoothing down her skirts. "But I need more than security. I need a partnership, a true marriage." "Then I wish you luck, Miss Vernon. The West is a hard place, and Morrison's ranch is small. You may come to regret this choice." Theodore was already turning back to his paperwork, dismissing her. As Beatrice walked out of the mine office into the bright Colorado sunshine, she felt lighter than she had in months. She had no money, no home, and only borrowed clothes to her name, but she had her freedom and the possibility of something real with Fletcher Morrison. Fletcher was waiting for her at the general store, pacing nervously. When he saw her, he stopped mid-stride, his whole body tense with anticipation. "It is done," Beatrice said simply. "I am no longer betrothed to Theodore Ashford." Fletcher closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around in a moment of pure joy that made several passing townspeople stop and stare. Beatrice laughed, her arms around his neck, feeling free and terrified and exhilarated all at once. When he set her down, Fletcher cupped her face in both hands and kissed her, right there in the middle of the street, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, that promised everything and asked for everything in return. Beatrice kissed him back, not caring who saw, not caring about propriety or reputation or anything, except the feeling of his lips on hers and the solid strength of him surrounding her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "Come home with me," he said. "Come see the ranch, meet my brother, stay for dinner at least, and then I will bring you back to town if you want." "I do not think I will want to come back," Beatrice admitted. "Then stay. Not in my house, not until we are properly married, but stay in the area. I will build you a small cabin nearby, close enough to be proper, but close enough that I can see you every day. Frank and I will keep you safe and supplied until we can marry." "How long until we can marry?" Beatrice felt bold asking, but Fletcher's kiss had burned away her hesitation. 2 weeks if we post the banns this Sunday, less if we can find a traveling preacher who does not care about propriety." Fletcher grinned. "I do not want to wait any longer than necessary. I have already wasted 2 years avoiding women because of Mary Beth's betrayal. I am not wasting any more time now that I have found you." They rode out to Fletcher's ranch that afternoon, Beatrice riding behind Fletcher on his sturdy buckskin horse, her arms wrapped around his waist and her cheek pressed against his back. The ride was about 2 hours through beautiful mountain country, following creek beds and crossing meadows still green despite the late summer heat. The fire had not reached this area, and the landscape was pristine and wild. The Morrison Ranch sat in a natural bowl of land where a creek ran year-round, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. The house was a solid log structure with a wide porch and stone chimney, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Horses grazed in a large pasture, and Beatrice could see cattle dotting the hillsides in the distance. Frank Morrison was working in the corral when they arrived, training a young horse on a lead line. He was a few years younger than Fletcher, with darker hair and a stockier build, but the same honest eyes and capable hands. He stopped working when he saw them approach, his eyebrows rising when Beatrice dismounted with Fletcher's help. "Frank, this is Beatrice Vernon from Boston," Fletcher said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "Beatrice, my brother Frank." "The Boston bride," Frank said, wiping his hand on his pants before offering it to shake. "Heard you were supposed to marry Theodore Ashford." "Was supposed to, yes, but plans changed." Beatrice shook his hand firmly, meeting his appraising gaze directly. Frank looked between Beatrice and Fletcher, taking in their joined hands and the way they stood close together, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Well now, that is interesting. Does this mean what I think it means?" "It means Beatrice is going to marry me instead, if she is willing to put up with ranch life and a rough cowboy." Fletcher squeezed her hand. "Willing and eager," Beatrice confirmed, and felt Fletcher's fingers tighten on hers in response. Frank let out a whoop of laughter and came forward to clap Fletcher on the shoulder. "About damn time you found someone. Welcome to the family, Beatrice. I hope you know what you are getting into." "I am learning," Beatrice said with a smile. They spent the rest of the afternoon showing Beatrice around the ranch. She saw the stable where Fletcher trained and boarded horses, the cattle operation that provided their primary income, and the hay fields that would be harvested soon. Frank explained their plans to expand, to buy more breeding stock, to build their reputation as suppliers of quality horses. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Fletcher took Beatrice's hand and led her up a small rise behind the house. From there, they could see the entire valley, the mountains rising purple in the distance, the creek sparkling in the fading light. "This is what I can offer you," Fletcher said quietly. "This land, this life. It is not easy. Winters here are brutal. Sometimes we are snowed in for weeks. Summers are short. The work is hard and never-ending. But it is beautiful, and it is ours, free and clear." Beatrice looked out over the valley and felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was what she had been seeking without knowing it. Not the artificial security of a loveless marriage, but the real security of a place and a person she could build a life with. "It is perfect," she said simply. Fletcher exhaled as if he had been holding his breath. "I started building a small cabin last year, thinking maybe someday I would need it for a bunkhouse or storage. It is almost finished. I can complete it in a week, make it suitable for you to stay in until we marry." "A week?" Beatrice turned to face him, stepping into his arms. "That seems like a very long time." "It does," Fletcher agreed, his voice going husky. He bent his head and kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, tasting and exploring. Beatrice felt heat pool low in her belly, a wanting she had never experienced before. When they broke apart, both flushed and breathing hard, Fletcher rested his chin on top of her head. "I will court you properly," he said, "no matter how much I want to skip to the end. You deserve romance and attention and proof that I am serious about this." "You carried me through fire," Beatrice pointed out. "I think that counts as proof." But she understood what he meant. They had come together in crisis and desperation, and now they needed to build a foundation in calmer times. They needed to learn each other's habits and thoughts, to share stories and dreams, to transform attraction into something deeper and more lasting. Frank invited Beatrice to stay for dinner, and she accepted, sending word back to Sarah through a ranch hand who was heading to town for supplies. They ate venison stew and fresh bread around a simple wooden table, and Beatrice listened as the brothers told stories about the ranch, about breaking horses and chasing cattle and surviving the brutal winter of 1875 when they had nearly lost everything. "Fletcher does not talk much about growing up," Frank said at one point, grinning at his brother's discomfort. "But we came from Texas originally. Our parents had a small spread outside of Dallas. Pa died when Fletcher was 16, Ma 2 years later. We sold the place and came north, looking for new opportunities." "Texas is so different from here," Beatrice said, looking at Fletcher with new understanding. "You left everything you knew." Sometimes starting over is the only choice, Fletcher said. We could have stayed and tried to make a go of the old place, but it was haunted by memories. Coming to Colorado gave us a fresh start, a chance to build something of our own. Beatrice understood that better than most. She too had left everything familiar, seeking a fresh start in a new place. The difference was that Fletcher and Frank had found what they were looking for, while she was just beginning her search. As darkness fell, Fletcher insisted on riding Beatrice back to town, though Frank offered to do it to give them propriety. But Beatrice wanted the time alone with Fletcher, wanted to feel his arms around her for the 2-hour ride back to Animas Forks. They rode slowly, neither wanting to rush, talking quietly about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Fletcher told her about Mary Beth, about the humiliation of being left at the altar, about how he had sworn off women and focused only on the ranch for 2 years. "But then I saw you in that church," he said, "standing there in your wedding dress with fire all around, and something in me just knew. This is her. This is the one worth risking my heart for." Beatrice tightened her arms around his waist. "I felt it too. When you picked me up and ran, I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt safe. I trusted you completely in that moment, and I have never trusted anyone like that before. I will never give you cause to regret that trust," Fletcher promised. They reached Animas Forks near midnight, and Fletcher reluctantly let Beatrice dismount in front of the Grimes cabin. Sarah had left a lantern burning in the window, and the town was quiet and dark around them. "I will come back in 3 days," Fletcher said, still holding her hand, reluctant to let her go. "I need to finish the cabin and get some work done on the ranch. But then I will come back and I will not leave again until you are my wife." 3 days, Beatrice agreed. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him, a sweet goodnight kiss that still managed to make her pulse race. "I will be waiting." The next 3 days passed in a strange combination of busy work and impatient waiting. Beatrice threw herself into helping with the town's reconstruction, working alongside Martha and Sarah and dozens of others to sort donations, clean up debris, and begin the process of rebuilding. The physical labor kept her hands busy, but her mind was constantly on Fletcher, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking of her as constantly as she was thinking of him. She also used the time to get to know the people of Animas Forks better. She learned that Martha was a widow who had come west with her late husband 20 years ago, that Sarah's marriage to Thomas was a love match that had scandalized both their families, that the school teacher Miss Patterson was desperately in love with the town doctor, but too shy to say anything about it. On the 3rd day, Beatrice woke with a sense of anticipation thrumming through her veins. She borrowed one of Sarah's prettier dresses, a soft blue cotton that brought out the color in her eyes, and took extra care with her hair. Sarah watched with an indulgent smile, helping her pin up the curls. "You look like a woman in love," Sarah said. "I think I might be," Beatrice admitted. "Is that possible, to fall in love so quickly? I fell in love with Thomas the first time I saw him. He was covered in mine dust and looked like a wild man, but something in his smile made my heart stop." Sarah handed Beatrice a shawl. "When you know, you know. Do not let anyone tell you different." Fletcher arrived mid-morning, riding up to the Grimes cabin with a package wrapped in brown paper tucked under his arm. He had cleaned up, his face freshly shaved and his best shirt on, though he still wore his working boots and leather chaps. Beatrice thought he looked perfect. "I have something for you," he said, offering her the package after greeting her with a kiss that made Sarah discreetly retreat into the house. Beatrice unwrapped the paper carefully and found a dress inside, made of soft green wool with mother-of-pearl buttons. It was simple but beautifully made, practical but pretty. "I ordered it from the dressmaker in Silverton last week," Fletcher said, looking nervous. "I know you lost everything in the fire, and I wanted you to have something that was yours. If it does not fit or you do not like it, we can exchange it. Fletcher, this is too much." But Beatrice was already holding the dress up to herself, feeling the quality of the fabric. "It is not enough. You should have a whole trousseau. You should have fine things." Fletcher touched the dress gently. "But it is a start, and I thought the green would match your eyes." "My eyes are brown," Beatrice said, smiling. "They turn green when you are happy," Fletcher said seriously. "I noticed." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes at the sweetness of that observation, at the care he had taken to notice such a small detail. She carefully folded the dress and set it aside, then threw her arms around Fletcher's neck and kissed him with all the love and gratitude and desire she felt. They spent the day together, exploring the area around Animas Forks. Fletcher took her to a waterfall higher in the mountains, a place where the water cascaded down smooth rock into a crystal-clear pool. They sat on sun-warmed boulders and talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts on religion and politics and whether beef or chicken made better stew. "Tell me about Boston," Fletcher said at one point. "What was your life like before you came here?" Beatrice thought about how to explain the constraints of Eastern society to a man who had spent his life in wide open spaces. "It was small," she finally said. "Everything was small. Small rooms, small thoughts, small expectations. I was supposed to marry well and manage a household and produce children and never have an opinion on anything that mattered. When my parents died and left me with nothing, it felt like the end of the world. But now I think it might have been a beginning." "I am glad you came west," Fletcher said, taking her hand, "even though the circumstances were not what you planned." "I am glad too." Beatrice squeezed his fingers. "Though I wish I could have met you without almost dying in a fire." "We could pretend we met differently," Fletcher suggested with a smile. "We could say I was delivering horses and you were in town shopping, and our eyes met across the street, and it was love at first sight. But it would not be true. The truth is we met in fire and chaos, and you saved my life, and I fell in love with your courage before I fell in love with the rest of you." Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder. "I do not want to pretend any different." As the sun began to set, Fletcher led her back down the mountain to where he had left his horse. But instead of heading back to town immediately, he took a different trail, one that led east toward his ranch. "I want to show you the cabin," he said. "I finished it yesterday." The cabin sat about a quarter mile from the main ranch house, nestled among pine trees with a view of the creek. It was small, just one room with a loft, but it was solidly built with a stone fireplace and real glass windows. Fletcher had furnished it simply with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a rocking chair by the fireplace. "It is not fancy," Fletcher said, watching Beatrice explore the space. "But it is weatherproof and warm. You will be safe here." "It is wonderful." Beatrice ran her hand over the smooth wood of the table, noting the care that had gone into every detail. "You built this yourself?" "Frank helped with the roof. But yes, mostly me." Fletcher stood in the doorway, backlit by the fading sun. "I know we said we would wait until marriage, but I want you here, near me. I want to see you every day, share meals with you, show you how the ranch works. I want to court you properly. Then I will move in tomorrow," Beatrice decided, "if you will help me transport my meager belongings." "Belongings?" Fletcher raised an eyebrow. "You mean the 2 borrowed dresses and 1 pair of boots?" "Exactly those," Beatrice said, laughing. "I am a woman of limited means, Fletcher Morrison. Are you certain you want to court someone so impoverished?" In answer, Fletcher crossed the cabin in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. "I want to court you, marry you, build a life with you. I do not care if you come to me with nothing but the dress on your back. You are worth more than all the gold in these mountains." They kissed until the light faded completely, and Frank came looking for them, tactfully coughing before entering the cabin to remind them that propriety still mattered, even out here in the wilderness. Beatrice moved to the cabin the next day, with Sarah and Martha helping her transport her few belongings and adding supplies from their own stores. They brought quilts and dishes, candles and soap, flour and sugar and coffee, building up the small household until it felt like a real home. Fletcher was both delighted and nervous to have Beatrice so close. He visited multiple times each day, bringing her fresh milk from their cow, firewood for the stove, wildflowers he had picked on the range. They fell into an easy routine of shared meals and long conversations, of walking together in the evenings and sitting by the fire telling stories. Frank served as chaperone and guard dog, ensuring propriety was maintained, but also clearly delighted to see his brother so happy. He taught Beatrice how to ride properly, giving her an older mare named Daisy, who was patient and gentle. Beatrice had ridden a few times in Boston, sedate canters through city parks, but riding in the mountains was entirely different. She learned to trust the horse, to move with the animal rather than against it, and soon she was accompanying Fletcher on his daily rounds of the ranch. 2 weeks after moving to the cabin, they were married in a simple ceremony in the rebuilt church in Animas Forks. Beatrice wore the green dress Fletcher had given her with wildflowers in her hair. Fletcher wore his best suit, brushed clean and pressed, looking uncomfortable but handsome. Frank stood as witness, and half the town turned out to celebrate, bringing food and music and well wishes. Theodore Ashford did not attend, having already left Animus Forks for business in Denver, but Beatrice felt no regret at his absence. Martha Grimes cried happy tears, and Sarah's son, James, presented Beatrice with a bouquet of dandelions he had picked himself. The preacher was a traveling minister who happened to be passing through, a jovial man who kept the ceremony short but sweet. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed Beatrice with such tenderness and joy that several people in the congregation sighed audibly. The celebration lasted until after dark, with dancing in the street and enough food to feed twice as many people. Fletcher barely let Beatrice out of his sight, keeping her hand in his, looking at her with such love that she felt beautiful despite her simple dress and borrowed shoes. When they finally left the party to ride back to the ranch, with Frank discreetly staying in town to give them privacy, Beatrice felt nervous for the first time since agreeing to marry Fletcher. She was an innocent, knew the basics of what happened between husband and wife, but had no practical experience. Fletcher seemed to sense her nervousness because he rode slowly, talking softly about inconsequential things, giving her time to adjust. At the cabin, he lifted her down from the horse with careful hands and walked her to the door. Someone, probably Frank and Sarah, had lit candles inside and left flowers on the table. The bed had been made up with fresh linens, and there was a bottle of wine with 2 glasses waiting. "We do not have to do anything tonight," Fletcher said quietly, cupping her face. "We have all the time in the world." "I want to be your wife in every way," Beatrice said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I am just nervous. I do not want to disappoint you." "Impossible." Fletcher kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. "You could never disappoint me. We will figure this out together, just like we have figured out everything else." He poured them each a glass of wine, and they sat by the fire, talking quietly, letting the tension ease. Fletcher told her stories about learning to break horses, about the first time he had been thrown and how scared he had been to get back on. Beatrice told him about her mother, about the music lessons and the embroidery samplers, about the life she had left behind. Gradually, as the wine and warmth relaxed them, Fletcher began to kiss her more deeply, his hands moving from her face to her hair to her shoulders. Beatrice responded with growing confidence, her own hands exploring the solid muscle of his chest, the strong column of his neck. When he stood and offered his hand, she took it without hesitation and let him lead her to the bed. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and ultimately beautiful, 2 people learning each other's bodies and responses, fumbling through nerves and inexperience to find connection. Fletcher was patient and gentle, making sure Beatrice felt pleasure along with the initial discomfort. And by the time they lay tangled together afterward, Beatrice felt fundamentally changed, no longer a girl, but a woman, fully Fletcher's wife. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the first time either of them had said the words aloud. "I love you too," Fletcher responded, tightening his arms around her. "I think I have loved you since I saw you standing in that burning church, brave and beautiful, and refusing to give up." "I was terrified," Beatrice admitted. "But you did not panic. You did not freeze. You waited for rescue, but you were ready to save yourself if necessary." Fletcher kissed the top of her head. "That is when I knew you were strong enough for this life." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the fire dying to embers, the sounds of the night creatures outside their window, the only interruption to the peace. The first months of marriage were a revelation to Beatrice. She had expected to have to adjust to ranch life, had anticipated difficulty and homesickness and regret. Instead, she found that she loved the work, loved the rhythm of the seasons, loved the satisfaction of tangible accomplishment. Fletcher and Frank taught her everything, never condescending but patient with her mistakes. She learned to milk the cow, to gather eggs from the chickens they kept, to make bread and preserve food for the winter. She learned to recognize when a horse was lame, how to check cattle for disease, when to plant and when to harvest. But more than the practical skills, Beatrice learned what it meant to be part of a true partnership. Fletcher consulted her on decisions about the ranch, valued her opinions, listened when she had ideas about improvements. When she suggested they start a small vegetable garden, he helped her clear the land and build fences to keep out the deer. When she wanted to learn to shoot, he taught her patiently until she could hit targets with reasonable accuracy. Frank became the brother she had never had, teasing her mercilessly but also fiercely protective. When a traveling peddler made inappropriate comments about Beatrice's appearance, Frank had him off the property within minutes, and Fletcher made it clear the man would not be welcome to return. As fall turned to winter, bringing the first snows to the high country, Beatrice truly understood what Fletcher had meant about harsh conditions. They were snowed in for a week in November, unable to leave the ranch, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the barrel outside. But inside the cabin, with a roaring fire and Fletcher's arms around her at night, Beatrice had never felt warmer or safer. It was during that first winter that Beatrice realized she was pregnant. The signs were subtle at first: a missed monthly cycle, a slight queasiness in the mornings, a fatigue that seemed disproportionate to her activities. But as the weeks passed and the symptoms continued, she became certain. She told Fletcher on a cold January evening when they were alone in the cabin. He had been reading by the firelight while she worked on mending some shirts. The domestic scene so peaceful and perfect that she hated to disrupt it, but she could not keep the secret any longer. "Fletcher, I need to tell you something." She set aside her mending, folding her hands in her lap to still their trembling. He immediately closed his book, giving her his full attention. "What is wrong? Are you ill?" "Not ill. The opposite, actually." Beatrice took a deep breath. "I am with child. I am fairly certain. The timing would be right for it to have happened shortly after the wedding." For a moment, Fletcher simply stared at her, his face unreadable. Then a smile spread across his features, transforming him from serious rancher to joyful husband in an instant. He crossed to her, pulling her up from her chair and into his arms, spinning her around just as he had done the day she broke her betrothal to Theodore. "A baby," he breathed against her hair. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, though the answer was obvious in his embrace. "Happy does not begin to cover it. I am overjoyed, terrified, but overjoyed." Fletcher pulled back to look at her, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "Are you well? Do you need anything? Should you be resting more?" "I am well. Just tired sometimes, and certain smells make me queasy. But the doctor in town says that is normal." Beatrice had ridden to Animas Forks the previous week, ostensibly to visit Sarah, but actually to consult with Doc Patterson about her suspicions. "You rode to town without telling me?" Fletcher looked torn between admiration and concern. "Beatrice, you cannot take risks, not now." "I took no risks. I rode Daisy, who is the gentlest creature alive, and the weather was clear." But Beatrice understood his concern and appreciated it. "I will be more careful, I promise. But I will not become an invalid. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while still living their lives." Fletcher nodded, though she could see the worry in his eyes. "When? When will the baby come?" "Late July or early August, if my calculations are correct." Beatrice took his hand and placed it over her stomach. "We made this together, you and I, a child born of love and fire and courage. Born in fire, just like our love," Fletcher agreed. He knelt down in front of her, pressing his forehead against her stomach in a gesture so tender that Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. "I promise to be the best father I can be, to protect and provide and love this child with everything I have." "I know you will." Beatrice ran her fingers through his hair. "You are already a good man, Fletcher Morrison. You will be a wonderful father." Frank's reaction to the news was equally enthusiastic, though more boisterous. He whooped loud enough to startle the horses and immediately began making plans to build an addition onto the cabin for a nursery. Beatrice tried to tell him that was not necessary, that they had months to prepare, but Frank was already sketching plans and calculating lumber needs. The winter passed slowly, with Beatrice's pregnancy progressing normally despite the harsh conditions. She suffered from morning sickness that actually lasted most of the day, but Fletcher was patient and attentive, holding her hair when she was sick, and bringing her dry bread and weak tea to settle her stomach. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the brown landscape green, Beatrice's stomach had begun to swell noticeably, and she felt the first flutters of movement. "The baby moved," she told Fletcher one evening, taking his hand and pressing it to the firm curve of her belly. "Feel that? Like a butterfly fluttering." Fletcher's face was a picture of wonder as he felt the tiny movements under his palm. "That is our child, our son or daughter, moving and growing." His voice was rough with emotion. They spent long evenings discussing names, trying out different combinations and discarding them. Fletcher wanted to name a son after his father, James, while Beatrice favored biblical names like Samuel or David. For a girl, they considered names from both their families, settling on several possibilities without making a final decision. As Beatrice's pregnancy progressed, the ranch came alive with spring activity. Calves were born, requiring constant monitoring and care. The horses needed to be moved to higher pastures as the grass grew. The vegetable garden needed planting, and repairs from winter damage had to be made to buildings and fences. Beatrice helped with everything as long as she could, but by late June, her swollen belly made many tasks difficult. Fletcher finally convinced her to restrict herself to lighter duties, much to her frustration. She felt useless sitting on the porch snapping beans while Fletcher and Frank did the heavy work. "You are growing our child," Fletcher reminded her when she complained. "That is the most important job there is." In mid-July, 3 weeks before the baby was due, Beatrice woke in the night with a cramping pain low in her back. She lay quietly for a few minutes, wondering if she had slept wrong, but the pain came again, stronger this time. She touched Fletcher's shoulder, waking him gently. "I think it might be starting," she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the flutter of fear in her chest. Fletcher was instantly awake and alert. "The baby? Now? But it is too early." "Not by much. Babies come when they are ready." Beatrice breathed through another contraction, counting in her head. They were still far apart, but definitely regular. Fletcher dressed quickly and went to wake Frank, who rode immediately to Animas Forks to fetch Martha Grimes and Doc Patterson. Martha had helped birth half the babies in the county, and had agreed months ago to be present for Beatrice's delivery. Fletcher returned to the cabin and began heating water and gathering the supplies they had prepared, trying to be useful, but mostly just anxious. "You should rest," he told Beatrice, who was pacing the cabin. "Save your strength." "I cannot rest. Moving helps." Beatrice walked from one end of the small cabin to the other, pausing when contractions hit, breathing through them. Martha and Doc Patterson arrived 2 hours later, by which time Beatrice's contractions were coming every 10 minutes and strong enough to take her breath away. Martha took over with the calm efficiency of long experience, examining Beatrice and declaring that everything was progressing normally. "First babies take their time," Martha said. "This could be hours yet. Fletcher, you should wait outside." "I am not leaving her." Fletcher's jaw was set stubbornly. "Fletcher, it is not proper for husbands to be present at birth," Doc Patterson said gently. "I do not care about proper. She was there when I broke my arm setting fence posts, and I will be here for this." Fletcher looked at Beatrice. "If you want me here." "I want you here," Beatrice said without hesitation. She was past caring about propriety or convention. If Fletcher wanted to stay, she wanted him to stay. Martha and Doc Patterson exchanged glances, but did not argue further. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and effort, of Fletcher holding Beatrice's hand and wiping her face with cool cloths, of Martha coaching her breathing and telling her when to push. The sun rose and set again outside the cabin windows, and still the baby did not come. "Something is wrong," Doc Patterson finally said, his face grave. "The baby is in the wrong position. I can try to turn it, but it will be painful, and there are no guarantees." Beatrice, exhausted beyond measure, could only nod. Fletcher held her as Doc Patterson performed the procedure, her screams muffled against his chest. And then, finally, after more pushing and pain than Beatrice had thought possible to endure, the baby was born with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. "A boy," Martha announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the infant. "A healthy boy with good lungs." She placed the baby in Beatrice's arms, and Beatrice looked down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the perfect miniature fingers, and felt a love so overwhelming it took her breath away. Fletcher looked over her shoulder, his arm around them both, and she could see tears streaming down his face. "We have a son," he said wonderingly. "Beatrice, we have a son." "James," Beatrice said, remembering Fletcher's desire to name a son after his father. "James Fletcher Morrison." "Perfect," Fletcher whispered. He kissed Beatrice's temple, then gently touched the baby's cheek with one calloused finger. "Welcome to the world, Jamie. Your mother is the bravest woman I have ever known." Martha and Doc Patterson stayed through the night to ensure both mother and baby were stable, then left in the morning with instructions for care and feeding. Frank came to visit, marveling at his tiny nephew and already planning the boy's future on the ranch. The days after Jamie's birth passed in a haze of exhaustion and joy. Beatrice learned to nurse the baby, Fletcher learned to change swaddling cloths, and both of them learned to function on very little sleep. But every time Beatrice looked at their son, at Fletcher cradling the tiny baby against his chest with such infinite tenderness, she knew that every moment of pain and fear had been worth it. As summer turned to fall and Jamie grew from a tiny newborn to a robust infant, life on the ranch settled into a new normal. Beatrice learned to work with a baby strapped to her back in the Native American style that many frontier women adopted. Jamie's presence brought new joy to the Morrison ranch, and neighbors would sometimes ride out of their way just to see the baby and bring small gifts. On Jamie's first birthday, they held a party that brought together friends from Animas Forks and the surrounding ranches. Sarah and Thomas came with their children. Martha brought a beautiful quilt she had sewn herself, and even some of the miners from town made the trip. The cabin was packed with people, with laughter and music and the smells of good food. Beatrice stood on the porch, watching Fletcher show off their son to the assembled guests, and felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She thought about where she had been 2 years ago, standing in a burning church in a wedding dress, her future uncertain and frightening. She thought about the cowboy who had hoisted her over his shoulder and run through sparks and flames to save her life. That moment of fire and crisis had brought her here, to this life, to this love, to this family. The prairie fire had painted the sky red and destroyed half a town, but it had also brought her to Fletcher, had burned away her old life and made room for this new one. Happy thoughts? Fletcher appeared beside her, Jamie balanced on his hip. Very happy thoughts. Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder. I was thinking about the fire, about that day we met. Worst and best day of my life, Fletcher said. Worst because I thought the whole town might burn. Best because I found you. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if there had been no fire? If I had married Theodore as planned? Beatrice asked. No, because I do not believe in wondering about paths not taken. The fire happened, I found you, and we built this life together. That is the only reality that matters. Fletcher shifted Jamie to his other hip. Besides, I prefer to think it was fate. The universe knew we were meant to be together and had to burn down half a town to make it happen. Beatrice laughed. That seems like a rather extreme matchmaking technique. We are rather extreme people, Fletcher pointed out. You left everything you knew to travel across the country to marry a stranger. I ran into a burning building to save you. We court danger and drama. I prefer to think we court each other, Beatrice said, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. Jamie, squashed between his parents, made a noise of protest, and they broke apart laughing. Frank called from inside that the cake was being served, and they went back to join their guests. Fletcher's arm around Beatrice's waist, and their son babbling happily in the language only babies speak. The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings. The ranch prospered, with Fletcher's reputation for quality horses spreading throughout the territory. They expanded their herd, bought more land, and built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. 2 years after Jamie's birth, Beatrice delivered twin girls, Rose and Ruth, who proved to be as spirited and strong-willed as their mother. 3 years after that came another boy, Samuel, calm and thoughtful, where his brother was rambunctious and bold. Frank eventually married a widow from Silverton, a practical woman named Helen, who managed his bachelor chaos with good humor and firm discipline. They built a house on the northern edge of the ranch property, close enough to help with the work, but far enough to maintain their own space. Helen and Beatrice became close friends, and their children grew up together, a boisterous crew that kept both families busy and entertained. Animas Forks continued to grow, recovering from the fire to become a thriving mining town. The church was rebuilt, larger and grander than before, and Beatrice sometimes attended services there, sitting in a pew and remembering the day she had stood in the original building, wearing a wedding dress and watching the world burn. Theodore Ashford eventually remarried, choosing a banker's daughter from Denver, who seemed perfectly suited to his need for status and propriety. Beatrice saw them once when they passed through town, and she felt no regret, no longing for the life she might have had. She exchanged polite greetings and moved on, secure in the knowledge that she had chosen the right path, even if that path had led through fire. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Fletcher surprised Beatrice with a gift, a painting commissioned from a traveling artist. It showed a man carrying a woman through a wall of fire, the prairie burning behind them and the mountains rising ahead. The figures' faces were not detailed enough to be recognizable, but Beatrice knew it was meant to be them, captured in that moment when everything changed. "So we never forget," Fletcher said as she studied the painting with tears in her eyes. "As if I could ever forget." Beatrice touched the canvas gently, tracing the outline of the flames. "You saved my life that day." "You saved mine too," Fletcher corrected. "I was half dead inside after Mary Beth left, convinced I would never trust anyone again. Then you came along and reminded me what it meant to be brave, to take risks, to open my heart." They hung the painting over the fireplace in the main room of their house, where it became a conversation piece for visitors and a reminder for themselves of how their story began. Their children grew up knowing the tale of how their parents met, how a prairie fire had painted the sky red and changed two lives forever. Jamie grew into a young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning to break horses and manage cattle with natural skill. The twins were inseparable, despite being as different as day and night. Rose all fire and energy, while Ruth was quiet and artistic. Samuel proved to have a gift with numbers and helped manage the ranch's accounts even as a young boy. As Beatrice approached her 40th birthday, with her children growing and her body bearing the marks of age and childbearing, she sometimes stood on the porch of their home and looked out over the land they had built together. Fletcher would often join her, his hair now streaked with gray, his face more lined, but his eyes still as sharp and loving as they had been that first day. "Regrets?" he would sometimes ask, an old question between them. "None," she would always answer. "Not a single one." Because it was true. Her life had not been easy, had not been comfortable in the way her Boston upbringing had prepared her for. She had worked harder than she had ever imagined possible, had faced dangers and difficulties and moments of genuine fear. She had lost a baby between Ruth and Samuel, a daughter who had been born too early and lived only hours, and that grief was something she carried always. But she had also experienced joy and love and satisfaction beyond measure. She had built something real with her own hands and heart. She had raised children who were strong and capable and kind. She had spent every night for 20 years falling asleep in the arms of a man who loved her completely, who had chosen her again every single day. In the spring of 1898, as Colorado celebrated its recent statehood and the country buzzed with news of the Spanish-American War, Fletcher and Beatrice celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a party, inviting half the county, and the celebration lasted 2 days. There were speeches and toasts, gifts and tears, and the retelling of the story of how their parents had met, a tale that had achieved almost legendary status in the area. "To the cowboy who hoisted a bride and ran through sparks," Frank said, raising his glass in a toast, slightly drunk and more sentimental than usual, "and to the bride who was brave enough to let him." "To love that burns brighter than any fire," Sarah added, and everyone drank to that. That night, after the guests had finally gone home and the house had quieted, Fletcher and Beatrice walked up to the rise behind their house, the place where he had first shown her the ranch and asked her to build a life with him. The view had not changed much in 20 years, though there were more buildings now, more fences, more evidence of human habitation. But the mountains still rose purple in the distance, the creek still sparkled in the moonlight, and the air still smelled of pine and sage and possibility. 20 years, Beatrice said, leaning against Fletcher's solid warmth. "It has gone by so fast." "And we have 20 more ahead of us, God willing," Fletcher said, "and then 20 more after that." "We will be ancient," Beatrice laughed. "We will be together." Fletcher turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face the way he had done thousands of times over the years. "That is all that matters. As long as I have you, I have everything." He kissed her then, a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of 20 years of marriage, all the history and hope and love they had built together. And Beatrice kissed him back with all the gratitude and joy in her heart, thankful for the fire that had brought them together, for the courage they had shown in choosing each other, for every moment that had led them to this life. The prairie fire had painted the sky red that August day in 1878, destroying the old and making way for the new. The cowboy had hoisted a bride and run through sparks, saving her life and, unknowingly, his own. And from that moment of crisis and courage, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a love story written in soot and ash and tears and joy, a testament to the power of choosing bravely and loving completely. Their grandchildren would someday ask about the painting over the fireplace, would listen wide-eyed to the tale of fire and rescue and falling in love. And Beatrice would tell them the truth, that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best, that courage can be found in the most unexpected places, and that real love, the kind worth having, is always worth running through fire to find. Years continued to roll by like the seasons changing in the mountains, bringing new challenges and new joys. Jamie married a school teacher from Silverton, a clever woman named Anna who was not afraid of ranch life. They built their own home on Morrison land and gave Fletcher and Beatrice their first grandchildren, twin boys who proved as energetic as their father had been. Rose shocked the family by announcing she wanted to attend college in Denver, one of the first institutions accepting women for higher education. Fletcher was skeptical at first, worried about his daughter in the city, but Beatrice supported Rose's ambitions fiercely. When Rose graduated 4 years later with a teaching degree, the entire Morrison family made the trip to Denver for the ceremony, bursting with pride. Ruth discovered a talent for drawing and painting, her sketches of ranch life and mountain landscapes eventually gaining attention from art dealers in Denver and even San Francisco. She never married, content with her art and her place on the ranch, and Beatrice understood that not all women needed a husband to find fulfillment or happiness. Samuel proved to have both his father's practical skills and his mother's head for business. He modernized the ranch operations, implementing new breeding techniques and negotiating better contracts with buyers. When Fletcher began to slow down in his 60s, gradually turning over more responsibility to his sons, it was Samuel who took the lead in expanding the ranch to be one of the most prosperous in the region. Frank and Helen's children intermarried with various local families, creating a network of relationships that made the Morrison Ranch a central hub of the community. The 4th of July celebrations and Christmas parties at the Morrison spread became legendary, bringing together hundreds of people from throughout the region. Through it all, Fletcher and Beatrice remained the steady center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They aged together, Beatrice's brown hair turning silver, Fletcher's strong body gradually bowing under decades of hard work. But their love never diminished, never faded into mere companionship or habit. Fletcher still brought Beatrice wildflowers every week in summer, still held her hand during Sunday services, still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "How do you do it?" Sarah asked Beatrice once, during a quiet moment at a family gathering. They were both grandmothers now, watching their grandchildren play. "How have you and Fletcher stayed so in love after all these years? Most married folks I know just tolerate each other by this point." Beatrice thought about the question seriously. "We choose each other," she finally said. "Every day we choose each other. It would be easy to take each other for granted, to let resentments build or passion fade. But we made a decision early on that we would not do that. We would talk about problems instead of ignoring them. We would keep courting each other even after marriage. We would never stop being grateful for what we have." "That sounds like hard work," Sarah observed. "It is," Beatrice admitted. "But the best things always are, and Fletcher is worth every bit of effort." In the summer of 1908, on their 30th anniversary, the family gathered again for a celebration. Fletcher was 68 now, his hair completely gray, his movement slower but still steady. Beatrice was 60, her face lined with laugh lines and sun damage, her hands permanently roughened from decades of work. But when they danced together at the party, moving to a fiddle tune played by one of their grandsons, they could have been the young couple who married 30 years ago. So complete was their absorption in each other. "Remember when I carried you through the fire?" Fletcher said, his arms around her waist as they swayed. "I remember everything," Beatrice assured him, "every moment from that day to this." "Best day of my life, meeting you," Fletcher said, "even with the terror and chaos and nearly dying." "Best day of mine too," Beatrice agreed, "though I would not want to repeat the experience." Fletcher laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "No more fires for us. We have had enough drama for one lifetime." But he was wrong about that. One more fire awaited them, though this one was smaller and more personal. In the fall of 1909, the original cabin where Beatrice had lived before their marriage and where they had spent their first years together caught fire from a lightning strike. Fletcher saw the smoke and ran despite his age and the protests of everyone around him, determined to save the structure that held so many memories. Beatrice, seeing him run toward danger just as he had run toward the burning church 31 years earlier, felt her heart stop. She hiked up her skirts, ignoring her arthritic knees and the shocked calls of her children, and ran after her husband, just as terrified now as she had been then. She found Fletcher inside the burning cabin, trying to salvage items, coughing from smoke. Without hesitation, Beatrice grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door, reversing their original roles. "We have to leave," she shouted over the roar of flames. "Nothing in here is worth your life." Fletcher resisted for a moment, then allowed her to pull him outside just as the roof began to collapse. They stumbled away from the building, coughing and covered in soot, and stood watching as the cabin burned to the ground, their children and grandchildren surrounding them with blankets and water and relief. "Foolish old man," Beatrice scolded, even as she held Fletcher tight. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about our wedding night, about Jamie being born, about all the memories in that place," Fletcher said, still catching his breath. "I did not want to lose them. The memories are not in the building. They are here." Beatrice touched his chest, over his heart. "They are in us, and in our children, and in the life we built together. We do not need that cabin to remember." Fletcher nodded slowly, understanding but still sad. They stood together, husband and wife, for 3 decades, watching the fire burn itself out. Their children worried and fussed, but Beatrice and Fletcher only had eyes for each other, remembering another fire, another moment when they had faced destruction and survived. "Still saving me," Fletcher said with a slight smile. "Always," Beatrice promised. "Just like you saved me, that is what we do." The years after that seemed to accelerate, time moving faster, as it always does when there is less of it left. Fletcher's health began to decline gradually, his strong body finally succumbing to decades of hard labor and injury. He developed a persistent cough, his joints ached constantly, and by his 75th birthday, he rarely left the house. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Beatrice never wavered. They spent long, quiet hours together, reading and talking, and simply being in each other's presence. Beatrice read him newspaper accounts of the changing world, of automobiles replacing horses and airplanes taking to the sky, and Fletcher would shake his head in wonder at how much the world had transformed since their youth. "We are relics," he said once, "dinosaurs from another age." "We are survivors," Beatrice corrected. "We lived through the Wild West and into the modern age. That is something to be proud of." In the spring of 1913, Fletcher took a turn for the worse. The doctor from town made a house call and delivered the news everyone had been dreading. Fletcher's heart was failing, weakened by age and hard living. There was nothing to be done except make him comfortable and wait. Beatrice refused to leave his side. She moved a chair next to their bed and sat with him day and night, holding his hand, telling him stories, reminding him of all the good years they had shared. Their children came and went, paying their respects, saying their goodbyes. The grandchildren were brought in to see their grandfather one last time, but mostly it was just the two of them, husband and wife, finishing the journey they had begun together 35 years earlier in fire and chaos. "I am not afraid," Fletcher told her one night when they were alone. "I have lived a good life. I married the woman I loved. I built something lasting. I have no regrets." "Neither do I," Beatrice said, though tears streamed down her face. "You gave me everything, Fletcher. A home, a family, a purpose, a love worth living for. How can I bear to be without you?" "You will bear it because you are strong," Fletcher said, his voice weak but certain. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. And you are not alone. You have our children, our grandchildren, this land we built together. I will always be with you, in every corner of this ranch, in every memory we made." "Promise me something," Beatrice said, gripping his hand tighter. "Anything," Fletcher breathed. "Promise me that if there is an afterlife, if we get another chance, you will find me again. You will come through fire or flood or whatever it takes, and you will find me again." Her voice broke on the last words. "I promise," Fletcher said, smiling despite the pain. "I will always find you. In this life or the next, you are mine and I am yours. Nothing can change that. He died 3 hours later, just as the sun was rising, his hand still clasped in Beatrice's. His last words were, "I love you," and Beatrice said them back through her tears, holding him as his breathing slowed and then stopped as the strongest man she had ever known slipped peacefully away. The funeral was the largest ever seen in the region, with people coming from 3 states to pay their respects. Fletcher had been respected and loved throughout the territory, and his passing marked the end of an era. They buried him on the rise behind the house, in the spot where he had first shown Beatrice the ranch and asked her to build a life with him. The pain of losing Fletcher was unlike anything Beatrice had ever experienced, even worse than losing her parents, even worse than the baby she had lost. Fletcher had been her partner, her love, her other half for 35 years. The world felt fundamentally wrong without him in it. But she survived, just as he had known she would. She found purpose in their children and grandchildren, in maintaining the ranch they had built together, in preserving their legacy. She told stories about Fletcher to anyone who would listen, ensuring that his memory would live on long after she was gone. Years passed, and Beatrice aged into her 80s, her body failing, but her mind still sharp. She spent hours sitting on the porch of the house they had built, looking out over the land they had claimed together, talking to Fletcher as if he could hear her. Sometimes she walked up to his grave with flowers, telling him about their great-grandchildren, about the changes in the world, about how much she missed him. In the winter of 1918, during the terrible influenza epidemic that swept the world, Beatrice caught the illness. Her children urged her to fight, brought doctors and medicine, prayed and pleaded. But Beatrice, at age 90, was tired. She had lived a long, full life, had seen more joy and adventure than many people experienced in twice the years, and she was ready to see Fletcher again. On her last day, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Beatrice spoke clearly despite her weakened state. "Do not mourn for me," she told them. "I have lived the life I wanted, married the man I loved, built something beautiful and lasting. I am going to Fletcher now, and I go gladly." She closed her eyes, and her face took on an expression of peace and joy. "I can see him," she whispered. "He is waiting for me, just like he promised." And then Beatrice Vernon Morrison, born in Boston in 1828 and transformed by fire and love into a Colorado ranch woman, took her last breath and went to join her cowboy husband, closing the circle of a love story that had begun 40 years earlier when he hoisted her over his shoulder and ran through sparks to save her life. They buried her next to Fletcher on the rise overlooking the ranch, and the family placed a marker that told their story simply: Fletcher and Beatrice Morrison, bound by fire, united by love, together forever. Below that, someone added the line that had become family legend. The prairie fire painted the sky red, the cowboy hoisted a bride and ran through sparks, and love lived forever after. The ranch continued through the generations, always staying in Morrison hands, always maintaining the legacy that Fletcher and Beatrice had built. The painting of the man carrying the woman through fire hung in each subsequent generation's home, a reminder of where they came from and what their ancestors had sacrificed. And on certain summer evenings, when the light hits just right and shadows play across the mountains, some family members swear they can see 2 figures standing on the rise, hand in hand, looking out over the land they loved. Whether it is truly the spirits of Fletcher and Beatrice, or just the power of memory and love making itself felt across time, no one can say for certain. But the story remains, passed down through the generations, of a practical Boston woman who came west seeking security and found adventure instead, of a wounded cowboy who ran into fire and found healing in the woman he saved, of a love that burned brighter than any flame and lasted longer than any building or monument. It is a story of courage and choice, of second chances and new beginnings, of 2 people who found each other in the worst of circumstances and built the best of lives together. And in the end, perhaps that is what all the best love stories are. Not about perfect people in perfect circumstances, but about flawed humans who choose each other despite the obstacles, who run toward each other through fire and smoke and danger, who build something beautiful from the ashes of what came before. Fletcher and Beatrice's story was exactly that, a testament to the transformative power of love and the enduring strength of 2 hearts that beat as one, from that first moment when he hoisted her over his shoulder until the last moment when she closed her eyes and went to find him again in whatever comes after this life ends. The legacy they left was not just in the land they claimed or the children they raised, but in the example they set for how to love completely, courageously, and without reservation, showing everyone who came after them that the best things in life are worth running through fire to claim and protect, and that true love, once found, lasts not just until death parts us, but beyond, into whatever eternity awaits.